Could Sunday's election in Colombia decide the future of the Don Road Doctrine? Firmly on side with President Trump's agenda in Latin America, a far-right candidate pulls ahead. Struggling to rein in violent crime, will Colombians choose a Bukele-style candidate to rule from Bogota? And what would that mean for the region? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Colombia. "54 times bigger than El Salvador, with almost 9 times the population, Colombian presidential candidate Abelardo de la Espriella is pitching a Nayib Bukele model to tackle insecurity in Colombia. And he's rallied some support, both from within the country as well as from U.S. Republicans. And the latter is what some are taking issue with, as the United States pitches its own model of controlling the Western Hemisphere under Trump's Don Road Doctrine. Colombians face the choice of electing one candidate who says he'll be tough on crime and work with Donald Trump versus Ivan Cepeda, whom Trump describes as a radical left Marxist. Here's a look now at Colombia's pivotal election.
Colombia faces a choice which could alter the course of the country. Presidential elections were held at the end of May, but no candidate received a clear majority, so the country is heading to a runoff. Ivan Cepeda, the current leader of the left-wing ruling coalition, is seen as the continuity candidate of outgoing President Gustavo Petro, who cannot run again. The President of Colombia can only serve one 4-year term.
The main axis of policy during the next 4 years in our second progressive government will be advancing the elimination of poverty and overcoming social inequality. That will be the center of our concerns, and of course it will be connected with the other policies, both of the government and of the state.
Cepeda wants to continue Colombia's recent 4 years of left-wing politics, in a country historically dominated by the centre-right and the right. With similar anti-poverty, social and environmental aims, Cepeda also wants to continue the total peace process initiated by his predecessor. Colombia has been afflicted with internal conflict, paramilitary groups, and armed rebel factions since the 1960s. Total peace was an attempt by the outgoing president to rein in those groups through negotiation and compromise. In exchange for disarming and abandoning kidnappings, ransoms, and drug trade atrocities to instead rejoin legal local economies, armed groups and guerrilla factions were offered reduced sentences, allowed to retain some of their wealth, and military mobilizations against them were suspended. While it did result in a small but measurable reduction in violence between official security forces and armed groups, it led to an increase in overall violence between different armed groups. And those groups are also watching the election closely.
For both of them, if whoever arrives at the presidential palace invites dialogue and opens that space, the ELN will always be willing. If not, we will continue in confrontation with whoever arrives.
And fear for security and safety has driven a surge in support for right-wing challenger Abelardo de la Espriella. He argues that Colombia's worsening violence needs a tougher security intervention from the state. In his campaign, he does not shy away from pledging to use deadly force.
What is needed to apply the Pax Romana, that which is achieved with the force of arms and the laws of the Republic. Bandits who do not surrender will be neutralized as the law dictates, and if they surrender, they will be imprisoned in a real jail.
If elected, Colombia would become another Latin American nation swept up in a right-wing populist wave, joining the likes of Argentina, Chile, El Salvador, and several others. On the street, many Colombians are fearful the narrow margins of this runoff election could turn sour.
There is the fear that many of us have. Maybe it's because everyone will be expecting their candidate to win. And yes, we are very afraid that either side could take to the streets. So the atmosphere, the mood this week feels a bit sad.
Depending on who you ask, total peace is either a work in progress or a failure. and Gustavo Petro, the outgoing president, and his possible successor, Ivan Cepeda, were either the start of a new left-wing chapter for Colombia or a 4-year deviation on the nation's political radar. With an election so close and so aggressively fought by both sides, Colombia's political future is on a knife edge.
Joining me now to speak further about the wider implications of the Colombian election are from Bogota, Latin American Affairs correspondent Richard McColl, from Washington, human rights advocate at the Washington Office on Latin America, Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli, and also from Bogota, Director of Control Risks, Global Risk Analysis Team, Theodore Kahn. Thanks all so much for being with me. There really is so much at stake in this election, and it feels in so many ways like Colombia is just more polarized than ever. Richard, how much should the world be paying attention to what happens on Sunday?
Well, of course, Colombia being the US's, the US being Colombia's #1 trade partner, it's an incredibly important election, not only here, but of course, as we talk about the sort of Colombia's role in the wider picture of the Trump doctrine towards the Americas. But if we look at it from a Colombian perspective, of course, this election on Sunday is the opportunity for communities living under the authority of armed groups. They're posed with the choice of two radically different means of achieving public security. And well, how does the Trump doctrine look at that? Well, the Trump doctrine doesn't particularly look at that. It sees Colombia through the lens of migration, organized crime, and critical minerals. So, of course, Colombia is playing a hugely important role.
Yeah, Gimena, security is on voters' minds, and some in Latin America in general kind of want what El Salvador has now. They see over there a massive reduction in crime under President Bukele and an improving economy. But given Colombia's sheer size and its complexity, is there a chance that voters are being sold kind of easy answers to what are far more complicated problems?
Yes, so for the far right in Latin America, Nayib Bukele's security model is being lauded as the model to support, including by Republicans here in our US Congress. But this would not work in Colombia for multiple reasons. First of all, the geography of the country. Second, the size of the country and the multiplicity of actors. And also because the Colombian state does not have full control of the entire territory. In the past, hardline security policies have been implemented, especially under President Álvaro Uribe Vélez, and that led to also massive human rights abuses. So there is great fear that this type of policies implemented in Colombia could lead to severe human rights violations or arbitrary detentions. However, this is the model that the United States would like in the entire region as part of their Shield of the Americas. And this is the first time that we see that the U.S. is actually intervening very directly, with Trump putting out another tweet today endorsing Espriella specifically because they would like to have another partner in their Shield of the Americas.
Yeah, Gimena, quickly, I mean, how prevalent is that fear of returning to somewhat of the battle days, as you mentioned there? Because having said that, this right-wing candidate is very much leading in the polls now.
Yes, so I think that it's important to see in the first round who voted for whom. Most of the interior of the country and the urban centers, which are less affected and under less dominion and control of the illegal armed groups, basically voted for him, a hardline approach, because they think that that's just going to get rid of the problem, right? But they're not living that day in, day out. The people living in the outer peripheries, especially Afro-Colombian, indigenous, and other rural communities, mostly voted for Cepeda because they understand that multiple attempts to do hardline approaches to try to exterminate the illegal armed groups have not led to their being dismantled. It's led to some demobilizing and some regrouping because all of the long-term issues that lead people into this criminality are not being addressed.
Yeah. Theodore, speak to us then about how consequential this election is, for others as well in Latin America. If we look at the Donroe Doctrine and President Trump basically saying, you are our backyard to control. Do Colombia and its neighbors, for that matter, actually stand to benefit from that kind of influence? Because many argued, as we mentioned, it's backfired badly in the past.
Yeah, it's a complicated question because there is in Colombia a certain level of support for what the U.S. and Trump administration is doing in the region. Of course, there's a very strong ideological divide there, but the right wing here in Colombia and more generally in Latin America has a very positive view of the Trump administration's approach to the region. They view very positively the intervention in Venezuela, for example, and in general, the more aggressive militarized approach to drug trafficking. So under the Petro administration, as the other guests have already alluded to, there was a perception that security deteriorated, that the government's total peace initiative was a failure, that it was insufficiently sort of robust in terms of the military's response to the threat from armed groups, and that it was far too accommodating of the organized armed groups and criminal groups present in the country. And so there is significant appetite, certainly among the anti-Petro part of the population, for a much more robust approach to security. Now, Gimena mentioned that this is obviously not universally shared, but I think that among the sort of what appears to be majority of the population, narrow majority of the population that is disposed to vote for change, part of what's driving that is the expectation of a very different approach to security, including support from the U.S. and including sort of a realignment, sort of a reversion to Colombia's traditional stance of being very closely aligned with the U.S. on security.
Yeah.
So whether that will work is a very different question, and I agree that there are serious doubts there. But I think certainly there will be a large portion of the population that will view a change in security, security posture, and the realignment with the U.S. In a favorable light.
Quickly, though, I mean, you mentioned that. Okay, well, go ahead, Gimena.
No, the other problem is that you have to understand under the Trump administration, you've had a lot of promises and little delivery. So even in the Argentine elections, a huge economic package was promised, but it wasn't fully delivered. And so while the right-wing candidate is saying, I'm going to get this big plan, Colombia 2.0, all this money from the United States, I'm not too sure they will, because part of the National Defense Authorization and National Security document talk about wanting to get the other countries to take more co-responsibility in security. And so I think that it's kind of a twisted narrative of an expectation that may not come to fruition.
Yeah. Let me ask then, well, I'll come back to Richard, because as Theodore mentioned, there is general support for U.S. intervention in their neighbor Venezuela, for example. Would you imagine Colombia under right-wing leadership supporting the invasion potentially of Cuba? And is it happy at this point with what we're seeing in Venezuela, which is still under basically the same leadership minus Maduro?
Well, of course, Venezuela is a very, specific example of what the Trump administration is capable of. I think, obviously, I think most people, most outspoken people within Colombia agree that Maduro, obviously a dictator who stole elections and so on, had to go. No one really expected, if we had thought about early January of this year, that Delcy Rodriguez would be leading the charge. But what we can see through this, obviously, is if De La Espriella wins, he will support blindly any U.S. influence in the region. In particular, yes, anything pointed towards Cuba. He has spoken outlandishly about disemboweling communists and the left. He does talk about, silencing opposition. And the U.S. policy is very much, we believe that, it's about exerting pressure through regional allies in order to invoke change in this area. So I expect that there will be support from a De La Espriella government with regards to direct intervention in Latin America. Let's not look just with the bombing of the alleged drugs boats in the Pacific and the Caribbean. It's seen as a solution by De La Espriella, whereas if a Cepeda government would be far more antagonistic on this front, perhaps a Cepeda government might be seen more as an Arevalo government in Guatemala, not ideologically aligned, but pragmatic together.
Okay. Theodore, let me come back to you because there is another major issue at play here, and that is not just of interference from abroad and the fact that, U.S. Republicans are coming out publicly to support Colombian candidates here. There are also serious allegations of vote rigging. So are mechanisms in place to make sure this final round is transparent and that it won't be contested and doubted once the vote is finished?
Well, I think it's important to clarify first that Colombia has very solid electoral institutions, especially compared to some of its peers in the region. What we saw two weeks ago during the first round was that the votes were tabulated very, very quickly. The initial results are available within hours of polls closing. And then there's a process of sort of reviewing or scrutinizing those ballots, which generally takes 2 to 3 days, and that confirms the vote counts. And generally what we've seen is that the scrutinized results correspond with the initial sort of first count at an extremely high level. So that is, I think, solid evidence that the system is quite robust, quite well run, and quite effective in Colombia. That does not mean, of course, that there are not problems, and it does not mean that we will not see, disputes over the results. So despite what I just said, of course, President Petro, came out at the night of the first round and cast doubt on the results and said that essentially implied that he would not accept the results until the scrutinization process was complete, essentially implying that the initial results were not trustworthy. And that, of course, is unhealthy in a democracy. It's damaging. We saw a reaction to that with some sort of isolated minor disruptions and protests in Bogota and other cities by the Petro's supporters. So I think we will likely see similar dynamics after the second round. In the event, especially if De La Espriella wins. I think it's not at all clear, sort of the stance that Petro will take, whether he will accept the results. I think it depends a lot on sort of what the margin of victory is, how close it is. But certainly there will be, I think, some turbulence. And I think we can also expect, in particular in the case of a De La Espriella victory, that we will see some protests, some sort of response on the streets from the sort of left-wing base and the historic pact, diehard supporters who are essentially questioning the results. I don't think there will be sort of a real widespread doubt as to the legitimacy of the results. But again, that does not prevent political actors from trying to take advantage of the situation, as we've seen in so many other parts of the region and the world recently.
Okay, Gimena, I could see you agreeing mostly there. Let me come back. Yeah, well, go ahead if you had a comment.
No, and I also think we don't know what the response of the United States will be, because prior to the first round, we had U.S. senators and others. The U.S. sent over 80 electoral observation persons to Colombia, basically saying that they're going to monitor really close, make sure there's no coercion, what have you. And they were saying that they were ready to not accept the results if there was that. And so the question is, will the U.S. accept the results or not? There will be some level of coercion. There has been in all of the Colombian elections, and even the observation mission, the civil society one, MOI, has said that there are 57 parts of the country where the risk of that is very high. And so it depends on who is winning, right?
Okay. Richard, I'll tell you what, I want to come back to you and look again at something that Gimena had mostly alluded to, because we know that some in Latin America will remember the kind of heyday of U.S. intervention pretty much with horror. You know, when Republican presidents in the 70s and 80s backed a number of military dictators across Latin America, including Augusto Pinochet in Chile. Do you think any of that history resonates today, or do people feel in Colombia and elsewhere that these times are somehow completely different?
It's a very good question indeed. I think that this does obviously run very deep in Latin America. And U.S. intervention, direct and obviously indirectly in that way, and talking about Pinochet and others, would be seen, I think, overwhelmingly in a negative light, of course. And I think it runs quite deep. It's a very open wound in its way. It would be very difficult to understand that taking place, obviously, in a sovereign nation. But of course, seeing the Trump government and the Trump doctrine at this moment, it's not unreasonable to think that something might occur when, when so much is taking place in neighboring Ecuador. Then there's involvement in Bolivia as well. The region does seem a little bit unstable at the moment. I think it would hark back to the bad old days, of course. Hopefully it doesn't, though.
Yeah, and Gimena, De la Espriella says he would use the force of arms and the laws of the republic because bandits who do not surrender will be neutralized as the law dictates. I mean, does that not smack of potential for another, for example, false positive scandal? Speaking of dark memories, when armed forces allegedly murdered thousands of poor and even mentally disabled Colombians under then-President Uribe and said they had killed FARC and ELN guerrilla members.
Well, basically, it's a rehashing of what Alvaro Uribe did, which is basically anybody who was an opponent, anybody who criticized or what have you was basically the FARC or a terrorist, right? I think that Colombia went through quite a bit of democratization with the 2016 peace process in terms of politically, whether you like them or not, the FARC ended up being a political actor and proved to be a very bad one. So I think that there's been more tolerance, and it's sort of sad to see that we're going back to this black and white point of view, messages that don't unify, that go to people's passions, that get people all riled up. Here in the United States, and even some of the consulates, we've seen fights between people who are going to vote in the polls here, basically, just because they're wearing the different T-shirt or what have you. I mean, this is unacceptable and completely irresponsible, actually, from anyone running for office to be inciting that kind of hatred.
So, final question then for Theodore. I mean, if the plan is to kind of cut and paste the Bukele model here, does Colombia even have the military and resources to manage crime and narco traffickers to that extent, when especially organized crime in Colombia is in a sense institutionalized, and the money within that illicit community is so incredibly powerful?
Absolutely, yeah. I think the short answer is probably not. It's not at all clear that the military currently has the capacity and the resources to carry out the type of campaign that De La Espriella is envisioning. I think that we have seen it. It's clear that we have seen over the last decade deterioration in terms of the military's capability, in terms of manpower, in terms of aerial capacity, which is absolutely critical from a strategic perspective in Colombia. We've seen a deterioration in the intelligence capabilities of the armed forces. So the armed forces are weakened. They're still a very effective armed forces within the Latin American context, but they have been significantly weakened by these trends. And on the other side, we have a universe of armed groups where all the reverse has occurred. They have increased their manpower, they've increased their financial resources, they have increased their technological capabilities. One of the trends in the last 18 months is an enormous increase in the use of unmanned drones to carry out terrorist attacks. And that's something that in Colombia, where sort of aerial power is so important to the tactical environment, that sort of the development of those capabilities by the armed groups really does change the dynamic in terms of, sort of the balance of forces. So I think that there are severe limitations.
Yeah, and could
this,
mega prisons
sort of
ever
approach.
provide an answer similar to what we've seen in El Salvador? Is that not really an option for Colombia?
Well, I think mega prisons, it's a very different, environment, right? In Salvador, we had primarily sort of urban gangs, and they're much more concentrated geographically. So again, leaving aside, of course, the human rights concerns, it was just, sort of more feasible to just sort of round up people en masse in large cities. In Colombia, it's completely different dynamics.
Not scalable.
Gimena alluded to it. It's a much more rural and remote, situation in terms of the presence of these groups. So it's just not feasible to think that any security force is going to come in and sort of round up these armed actors en masse.
Theodore, that's going to have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd really like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.